Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Seed Talk with Lisa and Layne. Hey Layne.
Hello, are you staying warm, Lisa?
I am trying. I actually have the fire going over there, and
Oh,
just hearing the fire makes me warmer.
I love the sound of a fire.
And you know that Tucker's curled up in front of it, and that kind of that makes me warm. You know what I mean? It's that visual addition. So yeah, working at staying warm for sure. So friends, just a reminder, if you haven't dropped in over at thegardenersworkshop.com, this is your invitation. That is home base to what all that Layne and I do. That is where our online library of courses are over there, including the Cool Flower course by Layne and Lisa, as well as all of the seeds, tools, and supplies that you hear us mention here. So you're invited, and this is your personal invitation. So, Layne, what are we talking about today?
Well, today we have a topic that's going to be covering a lot of the most frequently asked questions we get about planting cool flowers in very early spring. So we're going to cover everything from, can I direct seed at that time, or should I only plant transplants? What do I do if my ground is frozen? Is there anything that maybe is best planted only in fall, or are there things that are best planted only potentially in very early spring? And what do I do if I live in a warm, frost-free climate? So we're just going to be covering some of these questions today to help you with your very early spring plantings.
Those are really frequently asked questions.
Yes,
Thank gosh.
yes.
All right, let's jump in.
So our first question is going to be just defining that very early spring planting window for cool season hardy annuals, aka cool flowers. So Lisa, when is the very early spring planting window that we're referring to? And do you recommend planting only transplants at that time, or is it okay to direct seed as well?
So, what a great image. And I just invite you to drop in over to YouTube if you're not there watching this. Layne always puts together a great PowerPoint. So, the very early spring planting window to get them in the ground is a surprisingly early date. It is 6 to 8 weeks before your last spring frost. And typically, you really needed to have prepared that planting area last fall because the soil is frequently too cold, wet, or frozen at this time to actually do that. And I do recommend only planting transplants because there's just not enough warmth outdoors at this time of the year to get seeds to break dormancy and sprout. So they'll just sit out there and wait for their conditions to show up. But then you're well past this window and you lose the benefits of the cool flower concept.
Yeah, and episode 20 was all about troubleshooting cool flowers, and we talked specifically about direct seeding in very early spring and gave people some alternatives if they still want to plant things in very early spring that prefer to be direct seeded, what they might want to try. So check out episode 20 if you want to hear more about that. All right, moving on to our next question. The ground is typically frozen where I live during the very early spring planting window. How would I be able to plant at that time?
So we have heard lots of interesting ways to get plants in the ground at the right time because, and I'm thinking of our friends up in Canada that are up in really northern regions. I'm thinking of the northwest of Canada. And I've just heard some really interesting ways. Once they got some cool season hardy annuals in the ground early, like to really experience the concept fully, they just experienced why it is so much worth all the work to do it. And so if your ground is typically frozen, this is a great reason why, you would prepare that planting area complete back in the fall. And then what I've heard all kinds of things from them. Most of them cover their bed in some type of mulch, whether it's, shredded bark or film or plastic or whatever it is that you use, so that literally if your ground is free from snow, if it wasn't frozen, you could just walk right out and plant, right? But let's just say it is frozen. Many of those growers actually lay a silage tarp, as you can see in this image, down on top of the beds. And you can see the form of these beds here. This was the no-till area in this garden. And what they have found is sometimes on a sunny afternoon, if they've got light snow cover, they can just pull the covers back to expose what's underneath, right? But if you still have really cold conditions going down and you leave the silage tarp down, the solar effect of that on the black silage tarp really can help your soil to warm quicker than it would if you didn't have the silage tarp down. And so if it's frozen solid, you really have no choice but to wait until it gets defrosted some, right? But you're still going to get your cool flowers in so much earlier than you could ever plant a warm season tender annual, so don't fret over that, but experiment with different ways. So I heard from one Canadian grower that she has what we're looking at right here. She had her beds made, silage tarp down, but she had like 10 inches of snow still on the ground. So she put another silage tarp on top of the snow to get the solar effect,
Yeah.
just make the most, and that helped to melt the snow quicker than if it hadn't been there. And so all of those steps, you just have to, I mean, you don't want to make a whole lot of extra work to you. However, you will soon learn. If you can find a positive way to do this, there are definitely benefits.
Okay, moving on to the next question. Are there any flowers that you don't plant in very early spring, and why?
So I would say the best general rule, it's not a rule, thing to look at is any cool season hardy annual that's on the shorter side. And for me, anything under 24 inches is a short flower. I mean, we're growing snaps 36 inches tall out in the garden. Anything that's under 24 inches is typically not a good candidate for me to fall to very early spring plant, because think of this, when you fall plant it, you plant it, and whether you plant a seed in the garden or a transplant, all winter, it grows into a little transplant if you direct sow it, or it is a transplant and it's getting well rooted in, and then it goes into winter and goes dormant. Well, throughout winter here, for me anyway, we have these warm spurts. Those plants might not be growing on the top, but they're like building little roots and just getting like all cozy in the soil. Then when spring starts to crack, it doesn't really have to do that. It's already done all of its housekeeping below ground, right? Versus when we very early spring plant, it has to do both of those jobs. It has to really get its roots laid in, and there's not much time before it has to start performing. And a perfect example of that are Iceland poppies. Iceland poppies, which we direct sow in the fall. I have planted plugs before, and they do great. I mean, I've bought in plugs, but they bloom here for us like the end of March. Well, typically, my very early spring planting window is mid-February to 1st of March. I couldn't plant them in mid-February, just say I got plugs, and expect them to perform as well as a plant that had been in the ground for several months. It just doesn't happen. So early bloomers and stuff that doesn't have a very long stem at best, right? At the best case scenario, I'm trying to think of another shorty, aren't good candidates for me for very early spring. There's just not enough time for them to elongate and do their job.
Okay, now we're going to do the opposite of that question. Are there any flowers you tend to only plant in very early spring, and why?
It's so funny when we were just talking about the short stems, I thought, well, then there's stock.
Yes.
So now, so now we're going to talk about stock. So stock is on the edge. I live on the edge of where it would be winter hardy, but the problem with stock is it goes from seed to bloom, and it will bloom on short days, meaning short day lengths. Um, if I fall plant it, it tries to bloom in the dead of winter, and I can't because I don't have any houses, no hoop or greenhouses. I can't net it. It can't be exposed to the elements. So I only plant stock in very early spring. I also have learned I only plant, no, I say this, I don't fall plant straw flowers in the fall, because they're on the edge of being winter hardy where I am. And I have found it's not necessary because they grow super tall, even when we plant them later in the season, because we succession plant them. Um,
Yeah.
but stock doesn't get super tall for us, but we still get a 24-inch stem. It's it's work because it blooms if I get it planted on time, which our stock just was born yesterday, for anybody wondering. Bobo started all the colors, including the pastels mix, Layne.
Oh,
And
good.
I know we needed that. We need an image of that. And so, but it blooms for Mother's Day. Anything that blooms in May, because if you don't make Mother's Day, then there's weddings, right? If you're selling to florists. So we only plant those in the very early spring that either perform best that way or they don't survive winter here. And I've just not found it necessary.
Could you also talk about Lysianthus and why you tend to only plant that one in very early spring now?
So Lysianthus is a cool season hardy annual. A lot of people don't realize that. And we did a test a couple of years ago, and the problem with fall planting Lysianthus is Lizzie is very susceptible to diseases from wet feet, meaning wet soil on its roots. And what happens
Yes.
during the winter is it gets wet in early, winter, and then it stays wet all winter because it just doesn't dry out. And so Lizzies can have disease issues. So we lost a bunch of Lizzie one year that was fall planted. And I thought, by golly, we're going to plant again in very early spring because I could see the plants were totally gone. We planted and we had decent results. So the following year we did a test. We planted, we ordered plugs to be delivered for fall planting and ordered the same varieties to be planted in very early spring and planted them literally side by side, beds side by side in the garden. And the performance was unsignificant difference.
Yeah.
Um, And so but we didn't lose plants to wet feet. So I could fall plant, but I don't, Lysianthus. It's just not necessary.
And that's a really good point that everyone should assess for themselves what works best because it really is different for everyone and depends on exactly where you live and your conditions.
Yes, you need to test your own waters. Another one that I no longer very early spring plant that we plant a lot of, and I used to plant in fall and very early spring was snapdragons. Because we
Yeah.
primary market was always florist. If you can sell a florist a snapdragon any time of year, right? So I would plant tons in the fall, and then I would plant many of the varieties again in very early spring. And what started to happen is the snaps that we planted in very early spring, they would grow and they would get not as tall and not as abundant, but tall enough and abundant enough. However, we started facing major disease issues. They fell victim to rust. I had never had rust on my rust is a very frequent flyer in the snapdragon patch. We had never
Yes.
had rust. And so we stopped planting in very early spring and we don't have rust. So that is that part of healthy plants can resist diseases just because they're healthier. And I think that's a really great example of that.
Okay, moving on to our final question. I live in a warm, frost-free climate. Should I plant cool flowers in very early spring, or should I just move on to some warm season things instead?
What a pretty image.
It is.
Summer, summer, y'all, you have to go over to YouTube and take a peek at this. Gorgeous. So if you live in a warm, frost-free climate, I'm just gonna go out there and say, I just don't even think that very early spring planting is for you. And so, our recommendation for planting cool flowers for you is to get them in the ground, 6 weeks or so before your coolest time of the year. And it's too late, especially let's just say you're listening to this and you've never learned about cool flowers and you just learned that, holy cow, we're talking about bells of Ireland and poppies and snapdragons and you want to grow them. My advice to you is save it for the fall, your fall, whatever that looks like for you, because the performance will be so discouraging at this time of the year. And again, experiment if you want, but you have to put your bulletproof vest on because when they don't do well, you have to remember that you really didn't practice the cool flower concept. Because it's very disappointing and we forget, oh yeah, I didn't really plant them when I was supposed to. Nobody remembers that they planted late or those were puny seedlings I planted or, you know what I mean? We forget that at the other
Yes.
end of the journey. So That's why I say I think that frost-free areas should go with what is their fall-like conditions.
And it's always a lot easier when you try to work with nature instead of trying to fight it.
Or mimic it, or, yeah,
Yes.
I mean, there is too much good stuff. Yes, there's too much good stuff in every single season to struggle with something to try to grow it out of its season.
All right, well, that wraps up this episode on very early spring planting of cool flowers. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to leave them over in the comment section on YouTube, or you can use the form linked in the show notes to submit your questions if you'd like us to potentially address them in a future episode. Please be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're watching or listening, and thank you again for joining us here on Seed Talk.
Until we meet again, friends. Ciao.
Bye.